Welcome to the Steel Curtain Podcast. It's Monday, July 21st, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are 2 days away from reporting to Latrobe for training camp to kick off the 2025 NFL season. I'm Josh Yourish, and today I'm going to take a look at the best defensive players in the AFC North and rank the defensive position groups 1 through 4 between the Steelers, Bengals, Browns, and Ravens, as I did for the offenses last week. If you're interested in that, go check out that show right after we finish up this one today. To get all the shows, of course, subscribe to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcasts. But before we get into that, I'm going to give my reaction to the TJ Watt extension, which I have not been able to do. That came in on Thursday, heading into what was for me a long weekend. So I haven't had a chance to give my reaction to that. I'll give you my reaction there. Hint at a couple of, free agents that the Steelers could potentially look into signing before training camp or in training camp if they get to training camp and things aren't going particularly well. The safety position is one that's been talked about a lot. We can get into that. And today, the Steelers debuted some interesting throwback uniforms. So we'll break that down as well, get into the new uniform for the 2025 Steelers season. First, though, the TJ Watt extension. 3 years, $123 million. As I mentioned, it came in on Thursday. It felt like there was a stalemate between the two sides and that this could potentially drag into a holdout or a hold in for training camp, which we've seen Watt do before. It was, the most pleasant, potentially hold in ever. Last time when he wanted an extension, he just worked out on the side on his own, was there at training camp, didn't make much of a fuss, was able to get the deal done. This time, it doesn't even need to go that far because the Steelers got it done ahead of camp. $41 million a year average annual value. That is barely ahead of Myles Garrett's 4-year, $160 million contract. So TJ Watt is now on an average annual basis the highest paid defensive player in the history of football. And this is a deal that goes through the 2028 season when TJ Watt will be 34 years old. My initial reaction was to look at where the outs are, right? These deals come in initially and don't show all of the guaranteed money. Myles Garrett's contract has much heavier guarantees than TJ Watt's does. There's a potential out for the Steelers in 2028 when Watt will be 34 years old, heading into the final year of this deal. The dead cap hit drops from $52 million in 2027 to just $10 million in 2028. He has this deal carries a $42 million cap hit in 2026 and 2027, the first 2 years of the deal. And then that drops as well in 2028. So the structure of the deal is very important, right? Because this is a 3-year, $123 million deal, but not really. It's a 2-year extension if the Steelers want it to be. It's a 3-year deal if Watt is playing that well and they want to continue to keep him on the roster that long, but they'll have leverage with the dead cap dropping that much to potentially restructure, to get an extension. And that drops things considerably if Watt is still playing and playing somewhat well, but not quite up to the $41 million a year level at the end of this deal. I'm not certain he's playing at that level right now, but we'll get into that in a second. I'm okay with it. It felt like there were a lot of Steelers fans who were trepidatious about the potential of signing Watt as the highest paid player in the NFL. And then once it happened, we're just celebrating that he was the highest player in the NFL and that he's potentially going to be a one helmet guy, like the Steelers have said they want him to be. I'm less lost in the idea of a one helmet guy and what that should mean and what that should be. TJ Watt is one of the best defensive players in Steelers history. Maybe the best that has been on the Steelers in my lifetime. It's Troy or TJ. The issue, though, is the Steelers haven't won a playoff game since TJ Watt's been on the roster. And that's not TJ's fault. Like, I'm not dinging TJ's legacy because the Steelers haven't had success, because he arrived at a time when the franchise was on a decline, heading into the end of Ben Roethlisberger's tenure as the franchise quarterback, and then, through Ben's injury and Ben aging and everything. So I'm not dinging TJ Watt for that. He made a huge play against Kansas City in one of the, early in one of the playoff games when it looked like maybe the Steelers were going to stun the Chiefs with that touchdown. This is not a TJ's legacy is dinged because he's an edge rusher. Myles Garrett's legacy as a potential Hall of Famer is not dinged because he's been on the Browns his entire career, though he does actually have a playoff win and TJ doesn't. But that's to say, I'm less caught up in the idea of TJ Watt being this one helmet guy, this legacy Steeler, because the Steelers haven't been the Steelers since TJ Watt has been on the roster. This hasn't been a run of great playoff success and legacy defining moments for TJ Watt. It's been a fantastic individual career with very little team success mixed into it. The comparison in my mind that my mind goes to on this, just purely on this one helmet debate, like we can get into the aspects of Watt as a player and him potentially tailing off and what this means for the Steelers going forward. But just on the Pittsburgh centric view of a one helmet player, what does that mean? How important is that to the city? Yes, it's important to the city. It's important to the franchise, especially with the Steelers being in this quarterback purgatory that they've been in for years and years, trying to figure it out with Kenny Pickett, trying to figure out with Russell Wilson, trying to figure out with Justin Fields, and now trying to figure it out with Aaron Rodgers. It's nice to have a guy like TJ Watt to put on the posters and to have on the Sunday Night Football graphic and to help get Sunday Night Football games and keep the franchise at the forefront of the NFL's mind, or at least the midbrain of the NFL's mind. But it's different than the Penguins locking in their core three guys, Letang and Crosby and Malkin. I mentioned Letang first there because he's somebody they should have potentially moved off of earlier. Malkin the same way. They should have potentially moved off of him earlier. And now they're kind of wearing that and have missed the playoffs multiple years. And the franchise is stuck in a similar state to where the Steelers are, just in the middle, maybe sneaking into the playoffs, but not a real threat and aging dramatically. There was a chance to move on from those guys and get something big for them and kickstart a rebuild around Crosby. The Penguins were never going to move on from him. And not to belabor this metaphor, this comparison, I guess, but I'm okay with doing that when you're in that situation where those three players have brought you 3 Stanley Cups, 3 championships. In the Steelers' case, TJ Watt has a Defensive Player of the Year. He's led the league in sacks. It's just a different situation. He's never held the Lombardi Trophy. And for some franchises, a Defensive Player of the Year, that would be a guy you have to hold on to for his entire career. This is one of your foundational players for the franchise. That's just not the Steelers. The Steelers have so many legends to hang their hat on and so many trophies in the history of the franchise, 6 Super Bowls, that an era-defining player for an era of mediocrity does not need to get some pay bump just so he's a one-helmet guy. That said, now let's talk about what this deal could be, what it could mean. Watt isn't likely to be a $40 million player at the end of this deal. By what a $40 million player means right now in the NFL, these contracts are going to continue to go up. There was a thought years ago, and I think it's still mostly true, that every time a quarterback signed a contract, it was immediately a bargain because no matter how big the contract was, because the cap was going to continue to go up and quarterbacks were always going to continue to get paid more and more and more, and the market was going to continually be reset. I think that is likely happening as well, especially at, big money positions like edge rusher. Edge rusher is, the highest paid position on the defensive side of the ball. Myles Garrett set the record. Now Watt set the record. Maybe there are other players, maybe Aiden Hutchinson, if he shows that he's healthy, he could set the record. There are other guys coming up. Trey Hendrickson potentially holding out right now. Maybe he could set the AAV record again. This deal is not going to be as cumbersome in the latter years of it as it is right now. And the reality is, at no point in this deal are the Steelers going to be paying a franchise quarterback rates, 40 to 60 million, right? Whatever, the 40 range being the mid-tier guys and the 60 being the upper echelon MVP caliber players. That's kind of the levels we've seen be created by the market. The Steelers aren't going to be paying that type of money at any point during this deal, unless they swing a massive trade for somebody in that price range and sign him to something of an extension. But it'll be Aaron Rodgers this year, who's not near that level because he came in on the cheap and allowed the Steelers a lot of flexibility. And because of his age, he couldn't demand the price tag he once did. And then next year, my assumption is that the Steelers are looking to the 2026 NFL draft to spend a first-round pick on a quarterback. Now, that may be too rigid of a plan, and you may need to be more flexible depending on how those quarterbacks perform and everything. But that likely seems the way that they're gaming this out, especially with so many comp picks likely to or certainly in next year's draft, because the Steelers' big free agent signings were not players who were just on the open market. They were players who were cut. So it doesn't count against the comp pick formula. All those machinations were put in place to get a massive number of picks, and including the George Pickens trade being later for a next year third round instead of before the draft for this year third round, or the market may have dictated that as well. But it feels like everything is put in place for the Steelers to trade up and pick a quarterback in the first round next year, which means at no point in this TJ Watt extension will they be paying top dollar for a quarterback. Even if that's not the case, likely they would draft one in 27 and do a stopgap again in 26. So when you have a cheap quarterback and an unsolved quarterback situation, you can spend more on the defensive side of the ball. Almost all of the most expensive defenses in the NFL, which the Steelers are the most expensive defense again this year, are on teams that either don't have an answer at quarterback, a long-term answer at quarterback, or have a rookie quarterback right now. Teams like the Patriots, Commanders, Raiders, these are the ones that are spending the most in the NFL on the defensive side of the ball. So that all makes sense. This deal could be more troublesome, more of a potential albatross, because I worry about how Watt is going to age. We've seen injuries wear on him late in seasons. We've seen last year he really slowed down the stretch as a pass rusher. We've seen bigger injuries, more significant injuries. I don't know that this is going to be the type of deal where you get plus value, right? You're paying for past production here. You're not looking to swing a plus value deal necessarily with this one. And paying for past production is never a good strategy for winning a Super Bowl. But the Steelers, just the reality of this franchise is they're not necessarily in a Super Bowl window and haven't been for a while. So am I grading on a curve a little bit there? Yeah, but that's just the reality of the situation when you don't have a franchise quarterback and you're competing more for playoff wins than Super Bowl wins. And there are also reasons to be a little bit optimistic for a bounce back year. And Watt was not bad last season, but his production really tailed off. he's still an elite run defender. That's something that gives me some hope that this deal will age a little bit better, even if the pass rush production falls off, because you can rely on TJ to be a super disruptive and reliable tackler in the run game, chasing things down on the backside. His effort, his motor make him, and along with obviously his talent and his ability to shed blockers and just set a hard edge, everything makes him an elite run defender, and that's going to continue to be the case. I don't think you don't quite need the same top end level of burst and bend to turn the corner, to be an effective run defender that you need to be one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. So that's something that gives me some optimism. And the other thing that gives me some optimism is that Watt has expressed throughout this offseason that he wants to move around more on the defensive line and, be more versatile in terms of the way he's attacking offenses. And that's something I yelled about and everyone yelled about last season, that Watt just lined up over the right tackle. It allowed offenses to know where he was going to be, to send a chip and a running back his way, to really slow him down and limit his production without needing to double team, without needing to scramble, without creating mismatches and one-on-ones in other places. Watt wants to do that more. We'll see how stubborn the coaching staff is, how stubborn Mike Tomlin and Terrell Austin are about moving him around along the defensive line, either just switching sides with Highsmith or putting him in the middle and using him in just different, unique ways, the way the Browns do with Myles Garrett and the way most other teams use their elite pass rushers to just create chaos for the opposing offense, the opposing quarterback. If that happens, I think you could see Watt's production tick back up a little bit, even if his physical gifts are tailing off some. So those are reasons for some optimism about this. And ultimately, the Steelers backed themselves into a corner. If Aaron Rodgers was not the quarterback this year, if the Steelers did not trade Minka Fitzpatrick for Jalen Ramsey, which in my estimation is, a move that signals you want to win now. Those are both moves you signal you want to try to win now, even though there are so many picks in next year's draft and there's a lot of optionality into the future. The Steelers are trying to capitalize on this 1-year window with Aaron Rodgers. So you backed yourself into a corner in these negotiations. Before the Rodgers signing, before those moves, I would have been more willing to argue that the Steelers should look to trade TJ Watt. The Steelers should really explore that. They should take a hard line and not make him the, highest paid player or dare him to hold out. Once you make those moves, you can't do that and not bring your best defensive player and probably the best player on your team. I would say certainly the best player on your team back for another year. And he's not going to play on a 1-year deal. So you had to give him this extension. Getting it to be essentially a 2-year deal with the out in year 3, it makes it something I can stomach a lot more than I was expecting to when this extension, this contract talk first came up. One of the interesting things in this deal, in this TJ Watt extension, is what it does to the other pieces on the defense. 2026 is the final year of Hayward's deal. So next season, not this upcoming one, at $19.1 million cap hit. Keanu Benton will be extension eligible next offseason, as will Nick Herbig. Could it prevent Benton or Herbig from getting paid? Potentially. Certainly Herbig. It could be a roadblock to getting him paid. Does this potentially, if things don't go well this season, make the Steelers a little more antsy to look to get out of the last year of the Hayward deal? Possibly. I think it just puts some pressure on those other guys along the defensive line because Watt is now locked in to this long-term deal that is difficult to get out of until 2028. And Derek Harmon, assuming he plays, anywhere close to what they're expecting is locked into a role on that defensive line. And other than that, there are real question marks. And I think the biggest question mark is Highsmith. Highsmith is signed through 2027, his age 30 season. So this year and two more at around $20 million. It escalates from 18 to 21 over the duration of the thing. So his cap hit is going up. The Steelers could get out of that deal next year with an $11 million dead cap hit, or the year after with a $5.6 million cap hit. So that's a deal they can get out of pretty quickly if they need to. Highsmith needs to have a really excellent year opposite TJ Watt to justify staying on the roster and getting paid that nearly $20 million cap hit. Now, certainly that means something different than when he signed it just a couple years ago. The cap has continued to go up, and that's just dwarfing these numbers and making them seem different. Like, that feels like a really big number. It's not a terribly expensive number, but the idea with a player like Alex Highsmith or even Nick Herbig, these, undervalued mid-round edge rushers who can get it really cheap, is not always to pay a premium to keep them on your team. It's to find another one opposite your dominant edge rusher. So, it was Bud Dupree first who figured it out once TJ became a dominant force. And then the Steelers decided ultimately, and injury played a part in that, not to pay him long term. And then Alex Highsmith emerged because it's so much easier when you're getting so many one-on-ones. And I think Highsmith is a really good player and a better player than Bud Dupree, but it is such an advantage to play opposite TJ Watt. Highsmith thrived, then they paid him. And you can do that when you're not paying a high-priced quarterback. So I understood the deal at the time. I still understand it. But then you draft Herbig, who looks like he could potentially be a really high-end rotational pass rusher, and you need depth there. So I'm not saying they should have drafted Herbig and moved off of Highsmith, but you want to keep finding those guys, not necessarily finding them at an extreme value and then paying them a market rate. So a priority with how big this deal is should be to find more talented mid-round young edge rushers instead of it's just more difficult to re-up with Highsmith or even have him see the end of that deal or sign Herbig to a big contract extension. It would be interesting to see how Omar Khan, who his background is in cap management, he was the cap manager for Kevin Colbert before taking over this job. So it'll be interesting to see how he manages that situation along the defensive line. But I think this sets some dominoes into play, and Highsmith could be the one most impacted by it. And I think it makes it pretty likely that he doesn't ultimately see the end of that deal unless he has a really great season in 2025. Those are my thoughts on the TJ deal. I'm okay with it. I can stomach it. I like that there's an out, and I like that it's not a 4 or 5 year deal. But making him the highest paid player on the defensive side of the ball gives me some pause heading into his 30s after the season we just saw. So we'll see how it plays out. Another thing that could potentially be playing out and is being talked about a little bit more heading into training camp, the Steelers report to Latrobe on Wednesday, and they'll do it with about $25 to $30 million in functional cap space. So the Steelers typically always like to go into the year with $10 million in cap space to work with. So that's 15 to 20 to potentially play with before breaking camp. Before breaking camp and getting ready for the regular season. There aren't $20 million worth of good options out there, and I don't know that the Steelers are going to get to that number. But there are a couple players that are interesting, worth keeping an eye on. We've talked about the wide receiver options last week, and Tommy and Shane talked about it on their Wednesday show. the rumors really heated up about the Steelers potentially trading for Juwan Jennings, the wide receiver from the San Francisco 49ers, who I really like. I really like Jennings as a player. I have for years. He's such an excellent blocker, just a weapon in the blocking game, or in the run game as a blocker, and a reliable possession receiver. He really made his bones initially on that team as just a third down. Almost his profile is almost that of a tight end, right? He's a really good blocker in the run game, and he's super reliable on third down as a security blanket type of possession receiver. But he does that at the wide receiver position. It makes it even more valuable. You have even more variability offensively when you have a guy like that out there. And last season, he was a 1,000-yard receiver. He was excellent. The 49ers had a lot of injury issues, and now he wants to be paid like it. Potentially could be on the trade block. For the Steelers specifically, I don't think that's a deal they should make. I think in general, thinking about this long term, while yes, it's a win now window, I really want to see if Roman Wilson or Calvin Austin can develop into a reliable number 2 opposite DK Metcalf in a potentially more real offense, more functional offense than last season's was, which relied just so much on Russell Wilson hitting deep balls. And if he didn't, things fell apart. And George Pickens being a weird, unreliable number 1 target. The options on the free agent market, Amari Cooper, Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis probably won't sign for a little bit. That's been the most talked about one. Neither of those guys, and Cooper, you can write off his bad year last year as, moving from the Browns to the Bills, and that's a tough acclimation process. But I don't see either guy as enough of a needle mover to take snaps away from Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson. Because the Steelers are not going to win a Super Bowl this year. That's just the reality of it. So let's see what Aaron Rodgers can do with these young guys. Let's see who are going to be the building blocks going forward, because Cooper and Gabe Davis are not going to be foundational offensive players. And on the idea of, the Steelers having the most expensive defense in the NFL, part of that is simply rooted in they didn't draft well on the offensive side of the ball for a really long time. So then you don't have anybody to pay. And free agents are not a reliable way to build an offense, let alone a roster. The Steelers historically have paid their guys when they develop. They wanted to pay Le'Veon Bell. They did pay Antonio Brown. They would have paid Najee Harris if he was a better football player. They did pay Pat Freiermuth. There just aren't enough of those guys developing into high-level offensive starters to build up your offensive payroll. So give your young receivers a better opportunity to do that, a better opportunity to be a foundational player going forward, rather than bringing in an Amari Cooper or a Gabe Davis. I'm not terribly interested in either of those guys, or even Juwan Jennings, who I really like, but I'd be hesitant to take an already a little bit older receiver because he came out of college at 23, 24. I'd be hesitant to pluck him out of a Kyle Shanahan offense and expect him to do the same thing with Arthur Smith. Especially when you're trying to preserve draft capital to get a quarterback. That's priority number 1. Number 1, 2, and 3 in my mind is getting a franchise quarterback. So you got to keep the powder dry in next year's draft and hang on to those assets to go and trade up for one. On the defensive side of the ball, this is where I'm a little bit more interested. And I will continue to rip the Steelers for having the highest paid defense in the league, most expensive defense in the league, and not performing like it. But what's a little bit more if you're going to get better performance? So the safety position, after the Minkah Fitzpatrick trade, it looks like it's going to be Deshaun Elliott and Juan Thornhill. back there. Thornhill he's a functional third safety. And if you're going to have a position where you're playing a replacement level or slightly below player anywhere on the roster in modern football, I'm okay with it being at safety. But if you can upgrade there, you have the money to do it. You don't view Thornhill as a guy you want to see him develop and be a long-term guy. You already have an aging secondary. Go sign Justin Simmons. Go sign Julian Blackmon. Those are the two names at the top of the list. Simmons in his 30s, free agent right now. Blackmon in his late 20s. Played his first 4 years with the Colts and then signed a 1-year deal to go back with the Colts last year. Now he's finally, on the free agent market. These are guys who are not going to be superstars. They're not going to be Minkah Fitzpatrick level players, but they are guys that I think would be an upgrade over Juan Thornhill, guys that I think could hold off moving Jalen Ramsey to safety, which feels like is his ultimate destiny. And I'm fine with that being his ultimate destiny. But the reason I liked the Minkah Ramsey trade was corner is a more valuable position than safety. So if you're looking at them as equivalent players, I'd rather have the corner, even if he's a little bit older. So keep him at corner, at least for this year. Hold off his move to safety, which feels inevitable, for at least a little bit longer, and go get a veteran like that, like one of those two guys. I think that makes camp a lot more interesting to see how that works. In the secondary, I think the Steelers could have a pretty good secondary, especially if Darius Slay still has something left. But I'd be interested in upgrading the safety position, especially when you have the money to do it and no young player waiting in the wings trying to develop. So that's where I would look to spend some of that money, some of that $25 to $30 million in functional cap space that the Steelers have right now. And they could create more if they wanted to with restructures. There's no need at this point to create any more cap space. So I'm definitely interested in whoever they determine to be the better fit for their scheme as that deep safety, because Elliott is going to be more around the line of scrimmage. And I love the way he played last year. We might get into that as a little teaser for the positional rankings in the AFC North and the All-AFC North preseason defense. But Simmons or Blackmon or if there's another free agent safety out there that the Steelers really like, add some depth to that position, because it's a glaring weakness right now. And what's a little bit more money spent on defense? If you're filling a hole and making that defense a more reliable unit, okay, maybe at least you'll get your money's worth for having the most expensive defense in the NFL, unlike last season when the Ravens steamrolled the Steelers in the first round of the playoffs. One little thing here before we get into those AFC North positional rankings on the defensive side of the ball. The Steelers unveiled a 1933 throwback uniform today that they're going to wear in Week 8 at home against the Green Bay Packers. Sure, like this is not a thing I really care about all that much, but it's pretty bad. I don't like it at all. I would rather have the Bumblebees back, because at least those were bad in a fun way. And a fun uniform, bad uniform is always good. These are just bad and, to me, pretty uninteresting. They're pretty accurate. If you go look at the actual 1933 uniforms, they're a pretty accurate representation of that. And the Steelers have done a throwback in this style before in history. I've saw pictures of those going around. The old version of the throwback was even worse. This one's a little bit better. But the issue is when you have the numbers on the front, the original 1933 uniform had the seal of the city of Pittsburgh in like the middle of the stomach, but that's right where the number has to go now. So that seal gets moved to the left chest. And it just makes the lines that we're feeding into that seal difficult to read and confusing. I think it might look better with like a one digit player, single digit numbered player instead of Freiermuth with number 88, which made it just extra confusing on the front. But I don't love these. I'm not going to be running out and buying one. I would say really the only uniform that the Steelers ever need to wear is the traditional block numbers. The numbers that are the Steelers uniforms now are not nearly as good as the block numbers were, and those would be maybe the best uniforms in the NFL if the Steelers just went back to the traditional block numbers. I even like when they do the gray face mask, but I'll settle for the black face mask. I think those would be one of the best uniforms in the NFL, non-Eagles Kelly Green and non-creamsicle division, because those two to me are just a tier above everybody else. But I think that's really the only uniform conversation I want to have about the Steelers. All right. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. Let's get into the AFC North, and I'll explain the exercise a little bit more if you weren't around for the offense, the preseason All-AFC offense and the positional rankings on that side of the ball. It's just to see, obviously, step one, the first goal you want to accomplish as a football team is you win your division. You win your division games, and you want to win your division to get a spot in the playoffs. Let's just look at how the Steelers compare to the rest of the division, because it's a really competitive one. One of the most competitive in the league, sans the Cleveland Browns. And how many of the players on the Steelers' current defense would make essentially an AFC North All-Star team? That's kind of the way to look at it for me and see where the strengths of this defense are. We'll start along the defensive line. I'm just doing 3 positional groups because it gets a little confusing if you're doing edge specific and interior and linebackers. And so I'm doing defensive line, including interior and edge rushers into that. For the Steelers, that includes Watt and Highsmith, who are technically linebackers. I'm doing off-ball linebackers, so kind of the second level, and then the secondary, all as one. We're not breaking it into corners and safeties or anything like that. And just taking a look at those positional rankings. We'll start with the defensive line. Pittsburgh Steelers, number 1. There's really not a question about it. For my concerns about Watt falling off and Hayward aging and that group aging in general, and gross misuse of Keanu Benton as a nose tackle instead of a penetrating 3 technique, it's still the best defensive line in the AFC North, and talent-wise, maybe the NFL. So the Steelers at number 1, the Browns at number 2, the Ravens at number 3, and the Bengals at number 4. The Bengals will move from number 4 to number 5 if they don't sign Trey Hendrickson, and if they somehow let Shamar Stewart go back to college football because they're giving him a non-guaranteed contract as a rookie. That's what they're offering their first-round rookie. If they manage to screw things up that badly, they'll jump to from number 4 to number 5 in a 4-team division. That's how bad the defensive line of the Cincinnati Bengals would be. And they made some small upgrades, getting TJ Slayton, a decent little move to pair with Hendrickson potentially on the interior. Hendrickson is an absolute superstar. One of, if not the most important defensive player in the NFL, because last year that Bengals defense was an atrocity. Russell Wilson proved that with a game that made me start to believe that the Steelers could actually win a playoff game. And boy, was I wrong about that. The Steelers have the deepest defensive line in the division. And though the Ravens have one of the best defenses in the NFL, and the Browns have Myles Garrett, the best defensive lineman in the NFL, it's not particularly close. Derek Harmon will start right away, which I love, because Tomlin is traditionally very hesitant to throw rookies out there. But last year, he deemed Fautanu the starting right tackle pretty much right away. Seems like they're doing the same thing with Harmon on the interior, and I love that. Hopefully he stays healthy, unlike Fautanu. And though Keanu Benton is better served at 3 technique than nose, he's a good player either way, adds to the depth. I'm okay with him being at the nose. Y.A. Black, the 6th round pick of the Steelers this year, was allegedly taking reps at 3 tech instead of nose, and that's wrong as well. We'll see what the usage ends up being, but there's so much talent on this unit. It's maybe too talented to fail. So I think the Steelers' defensive line is going to be really good. It should be really good. If it's not really good, everybody on that defensive staff should be fired. The edge rotation for the Steelers isn't quite as deep as other teams. See the Ravens with Kyle Van Noy and Mike Green, Adisa Isaac, Odafe Owe, David Ojabo, just a stable of guys that they can rotate in and out of there. But you don't need that level of depth when you have TJ Watt, and Watt just doesn't come off the field a whole heck of a lot. So you don't need to build up that type of rotation when you're paying Watt $40 million and you're paying Highsmith $20 million. Those guys are going to be on the field the majority of the time, and you have Herbig behind them. So that's enough depth for me to feel good about the edge rotation. The Ravens, as I mentioned, have insane depth on the edge, but just not that high level player. They do have one of the best interior defensive linemen in the division and in the NFL. I would put him behind Cam Hayward because I just think Cam Hayward was unbelievably impressive last year for his age and continues to be an ageless wonder. But Nnamdi Madubuike is a super solid interior defensive lineman who's disruptive, who's solid against the run. Like, that's a really smart and fun way that they've built out their defensive line in Baltimore around one, keystone on the interior, a stable of young athletic guys on the edge, and have Zach Orr, their defensive coordinator, figure it out. He's going to continue to. I think that defense is the best defense in this division, but I would rank it Ravens. Steelers and Browns are right on the same tier. Probably the Steelers, then the Browns, and then the Bengals after a chasm are fourth in terms of overall defenses. Looking at the off-ball linebacker situation, this is an interesting one because it's a bunch of individually good players and not very good groups. And then the Browns have a really solid group and no individual star because Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is out for the year, most likely, or at least most of it. I put the Ravens at 1, the Steelers at 2, the Browns at 3, and the Bengals at 4 for the off-ball linebacker rankings. I have big concerns about Patrick Queen, starting with the Steelers. I don't think he was particularly good last year and wasn't a great signing in free agency. I was concerned when the Steelers made it. They desperately needed to shore up that group, but coming into this season, I'm more excited about Peyton Wilson's potential than anything I've seen from Queen. I think he was just kind of a mess in that number 1 role, which he was a mess in Baltimore before Roquan Smith showed up to be the stabilizing force and the green dot player and get everyone in position. Queen is at his best when he can just fire downhill, either as a pass rusher or against the run. You can't do that as easily, as freely when you're making the calls and trying to get everyone into position. That frees up Peyton Wilson to do that. And maybe that's a reason I'm excited about him. But I am worried about Queen, and certainly Roquan Smith wasn't as good last year without him. But Roquan Smith is the better of the 2 players. So if you're looking at it that way, put the Ravens at number 1. If Owusu-Koramoah was healthy, the Browns would be number 1 in this group. They added Carson Schlesinger from UCLA in the draft to a group that includes Jordan Hicks and Devin Bush. And that's not as bad as you think it is because Devin Bush was actually a functional NFL player for the first time in his career last season, for the first time since his ACL injury in Pittsburgh, because he was actually looking very good before injuring his knee early in his career. So again, the Ravens barely, just mostly on the strength of Roquan Smith being one of the probably 3 best linebackers in the NFL behind Fred Warner and Zach Bond. I feel pretty good about putting him at number 3. Potential for that to fall off because Trenton Simpson next to him didn't look very good last year, but on the strength of Roquan, the Ravens go number 1 ahead of the Steelers at number 2. And then looking at the secondary, again, it's Ravens number 1, Browns number 2, Steelers number 3, and Bengals number 4. I don't think there's much argument about which team is number 1 here. The Ravens secondary is just incredibly loaded, and they added to it in the first round of the draft with one of my favorite picks of the first round. Kyle Hamilton is one of the most dynamic and interesting players, and some injuries on that defense could necessitate Hamilton playing like full-time safety instead of being a part-time nickel, part-time just around the line of scrimmage disruptor like he was early in his career and early last season before Zach Orr decided to move him back to deep safety to stabilize things. And boy, did he. He was excellent in that role. He can play anywhere in the secondary. So they're losing a bit of that element, but pairing him with Malachi Starks, their first round pick out of Georgia, is just an excellent pairing. I love Starks at Georgia, just really heady in the deep safety role. He can come up and be a tackler, but he's just gonna free things up and be rock solid. He's gonna be a perfect Ryan Clark to Kyle Hamilton's Troy Polamalu. And boy, does that make the Ravens that much scarier. Plus, they've just taken enough shots at outside corner. If Nate Wiggins continues to develop, I think he showed enough promise last season to allow, as long as he's good enough and their young guys are good enough to allow Marlon Humphrey to be in the nickel, then you're good. You're in a good spot. You're feeling really good about things. And I think that's the case for Baltimore, that it's probably, if not the best defense in the NFL, right up there. And their secondary is the number 1 reason why. And they just added to that strength. And that was such a good decision. And interesting comparison with the Steelers that did the same thing, because the Steelers maybe have the best defensive front in the NFL and they added to it in the first round. So I think both of those teams made really smart moves in the draft, just adding to a strength, filling what is a hole in an overall strong unit. And I think by filling that, it's going to make everybody else better. So the Ravens secondary is an easy number 1. The Browns at number 2, and everything was a mess there, but still Denzel Ward and Greg Newsome, who hasn't been what they wanted as a first-round pick, but is still a good corner. And Grant Delpit at safety developed and was interesting and talented last year. Everything was such a mess for that team. That offense was so non-functional last season that it made the defensive numbers just look so much worse. And how can you continue to play hard and play at the level that you would if you weren't constantly put in terrible situations and field position situations by turnovers and 3 and outs and punts? And I think that secondary is still very talented in Cleveland and slightly ahead of the Steelers at number 3. And then the Bengals again at number 4. That defense, they just need to invest more in it. And it's so tough to do when you have Jamar Chase and you have T. Higgins. So Joe Burrow's just going to have to figure things out, because he's the type of quarterback that's going to be at his, what quarterback wouldn't be at his best with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins? But I think Burrow, as far as elite guys go, I think he makes the juice worth the squeeze on paying guys like that, because he's so good at, he has such rapport with those guys specifically, but he's so good at maximizing the advantages that those guys create for him because he's such a cerebral passer. So I think that's a worthwhile team building strategy for them. You just got to figure out how to hit on mid and late round picks and even early round picks on the defensive side of the ball, which they weren't able to do. And that's a big reason they changed their defensive coordinator from Lou Anarumo to Al Golden, who it'll be interesting to see how this secondary performs under Al Golden, because at Notre Dame last year, he was so press man heavy and he had the dudes to do it. And if you can, that's a great strategy. And it led them all the way to the national championship game. But he doesn't have those dudes in Cincinnati. So you can't be playing the copious amount of man coverage that he did at Notre Dame. So it'll just be interesting to see how he adjusts and how that secondary responds to that new look defense. And a guy who is coming from the college ranks should know how to develop young players. There are a lot of young players on that unit. So that's something that'll be, intriguing to watch. But I think clearly the Bengals are still fourth in terms of secondaries and the Steelers at number 3. I feel like we've talked a lot about that group because of the Ramsey-Minka swap and what that group's going to look like. To me, it really comes down to, and I mentioned potential upgrade at safety and why I think that would be a good idea at the second safety spot opposite Deshaun Elliott, because I think Deshaun Elliott was excellent last season, better than Minka Fitzpatrick. It just comes down to, is Joey Porter Jr. actually going to take that next step? I think it was a good idea to bring in Ramsey for multiple reasons, but because JPJ at this point in his career, if he's your number 1, you have a problem. Hopefully that's not going to continue to be the case and he'll develop into a legit number 1 guy. But right now he's best served as a number 2, and you try to develop him and see what you have there, see if he can be less handsy, less penalty prone. And then does Darius Slay conversely have enough left? Does your young guy develop? Does your old guy stay good? If both hit, the Steelers should have one of, if not the best defense in the NFL. If one of the two hit, you're still in a decent spot because you have Beanie Bishop in the slot. And instead of sliding Ramsey into the slot when you go into nickel, you could just leave Ramsey on the outside and put Beanie Bishop there. I don't think Beanie Bishop is all that good of a player, but he took the ball away last year. He's interesting. He's something of a playmaker. I don't think he's a total liability. So that's enough that if one of those guys really doesn't work out on the outside, you can still be interesting. But those are two real gambles that Joey Porter Jr. will take a next step that he needs to take heading into his 3rd season, and that Darius Slay, the wheels won't completely fall off for a guy well into his 30s, but he played reliable in a really talented and young secondary in Philly last season as that team won the Super Bowl. So the Ravens 1, the Browns 2, the Steelers 3, and the Bengals 4 in terms of the secondary rankings. And that brings me to the part I'm most excited about, and hopefully you are as well. The preseason All-AFC North defense. Again, a fun exercise for Steelers fans to just see where the best players on the Steelers defense stack up against the best players on the other defenses in the AFC North. I'm not going to bury the lead. At edge, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the graphic now. But if you're listening, the big reveal, Myles Garrett and Trey Hendrickson. If I can only pick 2 edge rushers from the AFC North and I'm building a football team, building an all-star team, I'm taking Myles Garrett and Trey Hendrickson, and I'm leaving TJ Watt at home. And I'm not going to wait until the end of this exercise to litigate that. Let's just break it down now. Before getting into the numbers, let's consider the circumstances. I just talked about how TJ Watt is playing on, and he's part of this, a big reason of this, but is playing on potentially the most talented defensive line in the NFL. Was that defensive line quite as talented last year before drafting Derek Harmon? No, but it was certainly better than the group that Myles Garrett had in Cleveland, where they just drafted Mason Graham in the first round and desperately needed to pump up that pass rush. There was very little on the interior. There was almost nothing on the other side of Garrett in Cleveland. And for Trey Hendrickson, there was absolutely nothing outside of him. He was the most one-man show of any player in the NFL last year, either side of the ball. Trey Hendrickson was so far and away the best player on that Cincinnati defense and did so much to make them, I won't say like playable, functional, because they were terrible, and kept Joe Burrow out of the playoffs. And that's really difficult to do considering how historically great he was last season, the best season of his career. But Hendrickson was just so dominant that without him, it would have been even worse. It would have been even worse by a lot. Now let's get into the numbers. So Watt's circumstances were better than Garrett's and Hendrickson's. And yes, Watt gets chipped a ton. He does not get double teamed nearly at the rate that Myles Garrett does. He does not beat double teams nearly at the rate that Myles Garrett does. And same with Hendrickson, because defenses can just send everything there. Watt does have the disadvantage of not moving around at all, so teams can chip him so easily, but it's not nearly outweighed by just the lack of talent that was around Garrett and was around Hendrickson last season, and for the most part is around them heading into this year. Although if Mason Graham, the number 5 overall pick that Cleveland took after trading down, is really that dude, and I think he might be because he's super polished at Michigan and really disruptive on the interior, that could take some pressure off, but still, Garrett's going to be double teamed like crazy, and he's going to probably outproduce TJ Watt. And if we're looking at pressures, it's really not a competition. Myles Garrett last season, 83 pressures, led the NFL. Trey Hendrickson, 83 pressures, tied for the NFL lead. TJ Watt, 57 pressures. Pass rush snaps last season, Myles Garrett, 477. Trey Hendrickson, 514. TJ Watt, 599. 57 pressures and 85 more pass rush opportunities, pass rush snaps than Trey Hendrickson, who had 83, and over 100 more than Myles Garrett, who also had 83 pressures. It's just not even close. And if we look at the sacks, because you want to tell me pressures don't matter, who led the league in sacks last year? Oh yeah, Trey Hendrickson, 17.5. Who was number 2? Myles Garrett, 14. TJ Watt, 8th, 11.5. And TJ Watt is the finisher. And I think that's valuable. I think that's really valuable. Sacks are more valuable than pressures. And I think we're adjusting back to that, especially when you look at team pressure stats, because a player like Myles Garrett can beat his offensive tackle or even a tackle and a tight end, whoever's blocking him, and create a pressure. But when he gets through, if no one else is being disruptive on that defensive line, the quarterback can, easily step up, easily find a running lane, easily find an outlet, get the ball out of his hands, and not be as disrupted. But that's going to count as a pressure, right? If just one guy's getting there and not finishing the job, it's not always the most impactful thing. But even if we're looking at it through that lens of sacks are much more valuable than pressures, those two guys are still ahead of TJ last season. And TJ's the finisher. He wasn't last season. 11.5 sacks last season, 2023, 19, 2022 when he was injured, 5.5, and 2021, 22.5. So last year was his first, full season in a while under 15 sacks. Last full or full-ish season, under 15 sacks since 2019, he had 14 and a half. The lowest sack total since his rookie year when he wasn't injured in 2022. So that is a real concern and a real reason to leave Watt off in favor of Garrett and Hendrickson. And if we look at the pass rush win rate, which I think is valuable, I don't think it's everything. Like I said, a pressure is more valuable than a pass rush win. A sack is more valuable than a pressure. But Myles Garrett's pass rush win rate last season, 23.1%. Hendrickson, 20%. TJ Watt, 13.3%. It's just an undeniable drop-off from those two guys. And on true pass sets, which are, PFF's distinction for plays where it's a true drop back pass situation. The snaps when defensive ends can really pin their ears back and go get the quarterback. Myles Garrett, 31.5% pass rush win rate on those snaps. Trey Hendrickson, 25.7%. TJ Watt, 16%. It's not in the same ballpark. It's just not. And you want to be a watch the tape guy. The tape shows it. TJ Watt was not nearly as disruptive, not nearly as impactful, and didn't have the same burst and bend. Just didn't win as quickly, as violently, and as impactfully as he did in the past, and as those two guys did last season. Some good news for Steelers fans on my preseason All-AFC North defense. Defensive tackles, Cam Hayward, easy. Nnamdi Madubuike. I talked about both of them on the interior section. Hayward was remarkably disruptive as a pass rusher. He's been forced into situations in recent years where he's had to play nose even. And while he's not nearly as impactful there, he's such a solid run defender and can beat double teams on the interior. And his value, it's hard to overstate his value. In my opinion, he was the best player on the Steelers defense last season. And it wasn't particularly close between he and TJ Watt, even factoring in how good Watt was as a run defender last year. And he was great. Hayward was a better pass rusher relative to position because you're just not going to be as dominant on the interior, and a comparable, if not better, run defender last year. And Madubuike, fantastic for the Ravens. I already talked about him before. At linebacker, Roquan Smith and Logan Wilson. Logan Wilson, not good in coverage for Cincinnati. I already talked about Roquan Smith. He was a given on this list. The other thought was to put Patrick Queen with him. I just don't think Queen was good last year. And I'm hesitant to say he's going to be one of the best linebackers in the division this year. I really want to see it from him. Maybe another year in the system, another year comfortable being the green dot will change things. I have reasons for concern. When he's not that decisive player, flying around, free to just see ball, hit ball, I don't think he's the same caliber of linebacker. And he has to be that guy for the Steelers when, making decisions and playing in coverage and staying at home more and being a number one interior linebacker. Roquan Smith freed him up so much. And maybe in some ways he's doing the same for Peyton Wilson early in his career, and that's great. But I'm going with Logan Wilson from Cincinnati because he was so good against the run last year. Really reliable tackler, getting up there in age, 29 years old in his sixth year. But I still think as the rest of that defense continues to fall apart around he and Trey Hendrickson, he continues to be a very solid player at the heart of it. So I'll go with Logan Wilson over Roquan Smith and Roquan Smith over Patrick Queen. At cornerback, Denzel Ward and Jalen Ramsey. Ramsey is not the first team All-Pro that he once was, or at least was not last year in Miami, but he's still such a physical force on the outside, and he's able to hit you at the line of scrimmage and run with you. He's what the best version of Joey Porter Jr. would be. Like, Joey Porter Jr.'s ceiling is not as high as Jalen Ramsey's was because he's not that level of athlete, doesn't have that type of, mirroring ability and coverage, and even isn't that level of tackler. But at this point in Ramsey's career, I think he's the idealized version of what a long, oversized corner can be, like Porter can be. At nickel, it's Marlon Humphrey. That's the only reason he wasn't at the corner 2 spot over Ramsey, because he's just at his best when he's on the interior and he can be around the line of scrimmage and he can be a tackler in the run game. And he's part of what unlocks, having him on the inside is part of what unlocks the Ravens defense, being an extra body in the run game, but also being able to cover slot players so well. And then at safety, it's Kyle Hamilton and Deshaun Elliott. I'm interested to see what Elliott plays like this year without Minkah Fitzpatrick because, and I don't know why I keep saying his full name, without Minkah, because maybe it is a case of Minkah's back there. I know very few things are going to get over his head. He's still a reliable center fielder, though he's not taking the ball away. He's back there. You have that. You have a bit more freedom to fly around, a la the Roquan Smith, Patrick Queen relationship. And maybe now that that's gone, Elliott will feel the burden of it and not be as impactful. But I think he's such a physical force in the secondary. He's a good coverage player. And he can come into the box and play the run fit really well. He can play over the top. He's just a versatile all-around safety that the Steelers really need to be great this year, and I think he will be. He's no Kyle Hamilton because Kyle Hamilton is the best safety in the game right now. And obviously on this preseason All-AFC North defense. And that's a look at your unit. The Steelers got 3 guys on there: Elliott, Ramsey, and Cam Hayward. For the most expensive defense in the NFL, you'd probably want to have a little bit more representation. Part of that is because maybe the 3 best pass rushers in the NFL are all in this division and happen to take 2 of those spots away from TJ Watt. I think that's the big conversation for me, tying it all back into that extension that we talked about at the beginning, that extension. TJ Watt's 3-year, $123 million extension. He's a great edge rusher, outside linebacker, and he's an even better run defender than he is edge rusher. So that's why I chose to say he's a great outside linebacker over he's a great edge rusher, because pass rushing isn't everything at that position, but it's the biggest thing at that position. And he doesn't do it quite as well as the best of the best right now. And the Steelers just gave him a deal that pays him like the best of the best through 2028. At least definitely through 2027. No reason for panic. Certainly reason for concern. And not cause for celebration at all. I'm happy TJ Watt is still a Steeler. The Steelers are better because TJ Watt is still a Steeler this year. We'll have to see how that contract ages, because I have a feeling it's not going to be great. That'll do it for the show today. hour and 10. There was a lot to talk about. Football's almost back. The Steelers report to camp on Wednesday. Tommy and Shane will have you covered for that with their Wednesday show. So be sure you like and subscribe to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. We really appreciate your support. And until next week, as always, go Steelers.